Hello, everybody, and welcome back for another edition of Ukraine This Week with me, Don Arliff. Another bloody week in Ukraine with dozens killed and many more injured as Russia keeps striking civilian infrastructure while Trump is naively pushing for peace with a dictator who is trying to erase a nation. This week, our guests, Zarina Zabrisky, an American journalist based in Kherson, and Volodymyr Dubovyk, the director of the Center for International Studies, who's based in Odessa. But first, let's start with an overview of the highlights coming straight out of Ukraine.
Another week, another Russian strike on Ukrainian cities, reaping the harvest of death and destruction. 4 people were killed and dozens wounded in a series of Russian drone attacks in the northeastern Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. The drone strikes caused fires that damaged industrial buildings and several homes, prompting the deployment of firefighters to extinguish the blazes. Emergency services released this footage showing their efforts in the aftermath of the attack. In the central city of Kryvyi Rih, a Russian ballistic missile strike resulted in at least 4 deaths and 14 injuries. Among the wounded were an 8-year-old boy and a 6-year-old girl. The strike also caused significant damage to civilian infrastructure. Kryvyi Rih is the hometown of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who condemned the missile attack, describing it as an act of terror. The attacks in the city were just a small sample of the carnage Russia unleashed on Ukraine this week. Kirill Dmitriev, a top Russian official and Putin ally, met Steve Witkoff, President Trump's special envoy, at the White House on April 2nd, marking the first high-level Russian visit since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022. The talks focused on brokering a Russia-Ukraine ceasefire, with the U.S. temporarily lifting sanctions on Dmitriev to enable his trip. This follows Trump's frustration with stalled negotiations and threats of 50% tariffs on nations buying Russian oil if no truce is reached soon. Russia rejected a U.S. proposed 30-day ceasefire earlier this month, and a partial energy strike truce collapsed this week. Details of the meeting remain undisclosed, but it signals intensified U.S. efforts to end the conflict. The Kremlin called dialogue important, though no breakthroughs were announced as of Thursday evening. European nations have already pledged more than 50% of the €5 billion ammunition package requested by Ukraine. Speaking on April 3rd, EU Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas confirmed ongoing efforts to supply 2 million rounds of ammunition to Ukraine. Her statement follows a decision by EU leaders at the March 20th Brussels summit to address Ukraine's ammunition shortages through aid packages announced by individual member states over the past month. The European Union is launching a €16.7 million program to support Ukraine's preparation for EU membership. Titled Ukraine to EU, the initiative aims to help Ukraine navigate the complex accession process, especially during wartime, with a goal of EU membership by 2030. Ukraine applied for EU membership in 2022. The country has made quick progress achieving candidate status within months, with the initial negotiations formally launching in June 2024. Ukraine has successfully brought back 11 children who had been forcibly taken to Russia and Russian-occupied territories. The rescued group includes 6 girls and 5 boys, ranging from 2 to 16 years old. This operation marks another step in Ukraine's ongoing efforts to reunite families separated by the war. At least 20,000 Ukrainian children have been abducted since Russia's invasion in February 2022, with only 1,256 returned so far. High-ranking French and British military officials arrived in Kiev on Friday for talks with their Ukrainian counterparts on the possible deployment of troops as part of a ceasefire deal. The talks come after a meeting last week of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, a group of European countries supporting Ukraine in the war against Russia. Attendees of the meeting in Paris vowed to strengthen Kiev's army to ensure the country's future security. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot said on Friday there will be a need for military capacity or reassurance whenever peace is reached. More F-16 fighter jets are on their way to Ukraine, according to U.S. General Christopher Cavoli, commander of the United States European Command. President Volodymyr Zelensky has already confirmed the arrival of new F-16s, signaling ongoing efforts to fortify the country's skies. The majority of F-16s for Ukraine have come from northern European nations, including the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway. The arrival of more U.S.-trained pilots and jets could fundamentally bolster Kiev's capability against Russian missiles and frontline positions.
And now it's time to look at the war through the lens of a journalist on the ground in Ukraine. And for that, we're joined by American journalist Zarina Zabrisky, who has spent the most time as a foreign journalist in Kherson since its liberation. Hello, Zarina. Great to see you, and thanks for coming on this week.
Hi, Don. Great to see you again.
Now, it's been, from what we can tell over here, and I think you can tell us much better, it's been a very crazy week where you are in Kherson. The Russians seem to be trying to push to take that city. As we get to these peace talks, it's obvious that Russia does not control the city of Kherson itself, but is desperately trying to take it. What can you tell us about what you've seen and experienced this week?
Yes, Don. In fact, that has been an unprecedented week so far. In the way the Russian troops are using the combination of the scorched earth tactics or strategy. They combine the attacks by guided aerial bombs that destroy or could destroy the whole blocks. They are using artillery strikes, massive ones. In fact, one on the 27th of March continued about 3 hours with artillery strikes coming every 5 minutes. With what is now known as human safari drone attacks, with the small FPV and Mavic drones flying, hunting civilian vehicles, doing double taps, hitting the first responders coming to the scenes of destruction. And that was a day that the locals are now calling Armageddon. And in fact, so it was. And then on the 1st of April, they followed up with another attack on the power infrastructure, and that was the repeat from the 27th of March. On the 1st of April, 45,000 residents were left without power. At this point, there are hardly any windows left behind me. You see the plywood on the window, and that is the situation in pretty much every household in Kherson. Just today, an FPV drone attacked a car, a vehicle of volunteers trying to evacuate a family. Fortunately, everybody survived, but the car was destroyed. And right at the corner of my street, Dawn, earlier, an ambulance was attacked. It got to the point when I can record the sounds of drones right from my own balcony when the door is open.
Yeah, so this seems the situation, well, it just doesn't let up. Have you noticed that there's been actually an uptick from what you have described to us many times as being kind of normal with the human safari, but are you noticing an uptick on the artillery fire or these guided aerial bombs, as you mentioned?
Absolutely. Like I said, the uptick is, just to put it mildly. We've seen an unprecedented increase. And from what the authorities and my military contacts are telling me, this is coinciding with the attacks that the Russian military are attempting on the city of Kherson and on the islands in the middle of the Dnipro River. They are calling it a suicidal mission or one-way ticket. And some of my military contacts were telling me that the Dnipro River is in fact teeming with the dead Russian bodies. It's kind of graphic, but that's the reality in Kherson right now. I'm being told that the goal of such strategy is to gain the foothold on the right, as they call it here, the western bank of the Dnipro River in time with the final stage, which they hope of negotiations, so the Russians can claim, as you said, the city of Kherson, which still has 65,000 residents, and the whole region has 146,000 residents at the moment, because Kherson Oblast, or the Kherson region as we know it, has been put into the Russian Federation Constitution as the subject of the Russian Federation.
That's right. And Zarina, one last question before we go. Is there at least a little bit of hope? Are the Ukrainians putting up a good fight there, and are they taking the fight to the Russians at least?
Absolutely. Great question. And yes, I've been working very closely with the military this last week, going to the positions, and I have witnessed how well and smoothly the Ukrainian drone pilots are working, and the tanks, infantry, you name it. The spirit is up. The Ukrainian army is still as eager to fight the aggressor back as always.
All right, Zarina Zabrisky, you do keep yourself safe there in Kherson, and thank you very much for joining us on Ukraine This Week.
Thank you, Don.
Donald Trump seems to be learning the hard way that Vladimir Putin, first of all, doesn't care about death and destruction caused by his war of choice. Neither is he interested in a just and lasting peace where Ukraine retains its sovereignty and chooses its own future. And now joining me to discuss the latest in the attempted diplomacy to reach a ceasefire and other issues is Volodymyr Dubovyk, director of the Center of International Studies in Odessa. Hello, sir,
Hello.
and thank you very much for joining me on Ukraine This Week.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, great to have you. Now, I'd like to start off with the negotiations, which well, it's been over 3 weeks since Ukraine agreed to an unconditional ceasefire there in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, what we all have known and expected is Vladimir Putin would stall. I think the big question in our mind right now is just how much patience Donald Trump is going to have for these stalling tactics. One thing that Secretary of State Marco Rubio just said as he was at this NATO Foreign Ministers Summit there in Brussels is that Trump wants he will not participate in endless negotiations. So I guess the first question I'd like to pose to you is, was the Trump administration naive in not knowing who they're dealing with, Vladimir Putin, putting too much confidence in Vladimir Putin, thinking that he actually has an interest in ending the war? Do you think that the U.S. administration is going to have a very abrupt wake-up call?
Well, yes, I think they were a bit naive, and I think they underestimated the significance of this war for Putin, and of course overestimated the pleas in favor of peace and support of peace that Putin espoused. And again, we've heard from Mr. Putin that he is all for peace and that Trump believes him. And that reminds me of the first 4 years of presidency of Trump, when they met in Helsinki. It was this famous meeting, and Trump decided to believe Putin that Russia did not interfere in elections in 2016 over the conclusion of his own intelligence community. So I suppose there is a special, special glue or special power that Putin has over Trump. Does it mean that Trump can never really be angry and understand that Putin is playing him or buying time or grabbing for time or something? I don't know, but it seems that Putin has an unusual amount and resource of patience from Trump, unlike Zelensky, who was quickly called a dictator and a hurdle towards the peace. For very reason that he stood up for Ukraine's interests and tried to understand what's gonna come, what's supposed to come after the ceasefire, because Ukraine is always interested more in issues like security guarantees and neutrality or lack of neutrality, and the peacekeepers and other core questions and territorial issues as well, rather than just a ceasefire. But when Americans asked us, strongly, that can you still do a ceasefire, we agreed unconditionally, unlike Russia. And yes, Russia is indeed violating all this. First energy and infrastructure, and striking energy facilities and infrastructure. And now, of course, with the Black Sea ceasefire, which is proposed and Ukraine is agreeing, but Russia is putting up newer demands. And I think that would be their game. They will be putting up demands, basically saying we are in favor of ceasefire, but we just have a few things that needs to be resolved before we go forward. And we'll see. It seems that opening a new phase, a new stage in relations with Russia, and having rapprochement or reset with Russia is a priority to President Trump, and therefore Ukraine's interest, I think, can be sacrificed. But I'll be happy to be wrong about that.
Yeah, actually, that's great that you mentioned that, because I wanted to raise this point. Something that I've kind of noticed over the last several days is, we see a lot of signals coming out of Russia, actually. We heard, I think the whole world was shocked when we heard the rapprochement of the U.S.-Russia relationship, first of all, based on this devastating and bloody war. But if we look at the relationship with China, I think is the United States administration also being extremely naive in thinking that they can drive a wedge between the two, first of all. And the signals that we're seeing coming out of Moscow, we saw the Chinese foreign minister travel there, saying that Russia and China are friends forever. And apparently Xi Jinping has been invited to the Victory Day parades that are coming up in early May.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you 100% that I think that the idea that you can drive the wedge between Moscow and Beijing is a naive one, is based on illusion. This reverse Nixon, they call it, in a parallel of what was done in the early 1970s. It's not based on any reality, factual reality, or strong conceptual background. Russia and China will continue to be allies. Yes, there are certain things that maybe divide them. There are some differences on certain issues, tactical minor issues, but in general, they are allies and they need each other in this struggle for the bipolar world that they're waging. And therefore, I don't think this idea is really worth of looking at. And moreover, if you're thinking about weakening China, then maybe it's a good idea to start by weakening Russia and continue to support Ukraine to weaken Russia, because Russia is a key ally to China. So by undermining Russia's threat and decreasing Russian power, you're kind of decreasing the power and the influence that China has. So there is a connection here. So there is no disagreement, and there is no conflict really in between, trying to countervalue and counterweigh China and contain China on the one hand, and then helping Ukraine to continue to defend itself against Russia. And I think that all of these expectations that Russia would just play along, they are wrong. Russia might promise, by the way, to Washington that, yes, sure, let's just fix the Ukrainian question, and then we'll deal with China, we'll be with you, or maybe we'll help you with Iran, or maybe with something else. And then, of course, they have this new track of rare earth minerals as well. They're trying to say, oh, well, if Ukrainians are not signing something with you, you can sign something with us, because we have plenty of those as well. And there's always something. There's, of course, the strategic arms question, because many of the treaties are now not in function. And both Washington and Moscow are kind of interested in reviving those treaties. So there are many these lures, little things that Russia can carefully manipulating and promise and give it to and suggest to U.S. that we can work together. But once we solve this Ukrainian question, and you give us an upper hand in that.
This comes as the opinion polls in Ukraine, actually over 50% now say that Trump is a bad thing for Ukraine. Is there still, though, a shimmer of hope that, in fact, that if the naive Trump administration finally sees who they're up against in Vladimir Putin, and that he really doesn't want peace, Foreign policy has recently said that Putin can't end the war, even if he wanted to, because it's become so important for the economy and for society. Is there still maybe a shimmer of hope in Ukraine that the United States might take a different approach in dealing with Vladimir Putin and firmly back Kyiv to supply weapons and military support to make it very costly and very painful for Vladimir Putin?
There is, because Ukrainians actually had enough of the previous administration, which was supporting Ukraine, but sometimes with huge delays and many provisions on how those weapons have been given to us can be used, and fear of escalation by Russia, and in general, lack of a desire to lead the war to the defeat of Russia and full-scale victory of Ukraine. And therefore, the spoon feeding rather by Biden was really detrimental and disliked by Ukrainians, and that's why, surprisingly, in my view, but I can understand the view and the narrative and the public mood. A lot of people in Ukraine were quite willing to take a gamble with Trump because he is known as unconventional, disruptive, unpredictable politician. So maybe he can turn out for better for Ukraine. But now people are disillusioned first with his statements and then his moves. It's not only that U.S. is now positioning itself as a neutral country, as a honest broker should probably, but it's often siding with Russia. It is rhetorically, at least rhetorically, Trump and people of his administration, those people who were hawks before, like State Secretary Rubio or National Security Advisor Waltz, they're now often repeating the mantras and the narratives coming from Kremlin, including the point on the illegitimacy of Zelensky somehow. I was relieved to see actually the statement by the State Department the other day that they don't agree with Putin that there should be some kind of a temporary government of Ukraine, international management of Ukraine. But before that, they said that Zelensky should go away and should resign because he is an obstacle towards peace. So unfortunately, we're seeing the hard way that probably Trump does not have Ukraine's interest at heart. And that is how it was for a long period of time, actually. Unfortunately, he has a long history of negativity about Ukraine. He basically, in the last few years, shaped up the mood in the Republican Party, where you have so many doubters about the existence to Ukraine going forward. So even if the money which is still left from the previous administration and actually given to Ukraine by Congress is over soon for Ukraine, I don't see any future for the new package of financial assistance to Ukraine, which we would need. Not to mention that also Trump says that we'll sign something with Russia and then Europeans, you will have to deal with this and implement it and pay for it and send peacekeepers if needed. And we're not going to give Ukraine any security guarantees. So that's unfortunately going forward, that's wrong, because U.S. leadership is strongly needed here, like it was before. And actually it was a major example of success how Biden administration put together this pro-Ukraine coalition of countries, including Ukraine Defense Contact Group. But now, of course, there is a different situation, and everyone is wobbly in Europe specifically, understanding that on the one hand, you have Russian aggression ongoing on the other hand, you have quite unreliable and unpredictable Trump administration, and therefore Europe is in the middle, and they have to get their act together, and we're seeing these extraordinary measures in that direction.
Indeed, indeed. It is very difficult to just take the words from everything we're hearing from the administration, because there are lots of mixed signals. One point that I would make to that, and I'm actually hopeful that this is the case, Marco Rubio, I think, is the best communicator in this, in the fact that he said, you know, everybody was asking the administration why they're unable to say who invaded Ukraine, for instance, or why are they spewing these Russian talking points when it comes to Ukraine. And he said the strategy was to be able to get to sit at the table. I'm hopeful that that is indeed the case, but I'm also realistic and think that their chances of getting to the table are still very elusive, as we've very well seen in the past couple weeks. Now I'd like to move on and talk about the Ukraine minerals deal. It was a deal that before we had this blow up in the White House when President Zelensky went there, Ukraine was ready to sign the deal that had been prepared up until that point. Now we see this very different deal being thrown at Ukraine, and Trump's insistence that Ukraine signs it, but we've heard lots of problems with it. Now, Ukraine right now is currently undergoing a constitutional check to see if it's in line with the Constitution, and they're probably going to prepare a few negotiating points to come back to Washington, D.C. with. Have you looked at this? Do you know some certain provisions or some certain points that Ukraine needs to change in this agreement? Because obviously they're going to have to negotiate it, right?
Well, absolutely. I mean, first of all, let me say that Zelensky's team done a great job prior to the meeting on February 28th in the Oval Office in the White House on changing the previous draft of the treaty, where certain insertions were made and changes were applied, and it was modified. And maybe the fact that Zelensky didn't want to sign it right away actually led partially to this explosion, quotation marks, in the White House meeting, with people being not happy, irritated about Zelensky and annoyed about him doing that. But of course, when the first time Secretary Bessent came and said, I signed it right away, and Zelensky said, well, I haven't seen the thing, I'm not going to sign it right away because I don't know what is in there. And that was the only right approach. I mean, Ukraine needs to show that we're not a banana republic. Yes, we depend on the US support to a large extent, but that doesn't mean that we're going to trade away everything that we have, including our sovereignty. And with the New Deal, unfortunately, yes, I think it seems that they decided in the White House to teach Ukraine a lesson. Like, okay, you talked back to us and you actually kind of quarreled with us and argued with us in that meeting. So you're going to have as Trump said, that's at some point a better deal. Better for US and bigger for US, but not for Ukraine. Not to mention that this deal is not really needed by Ukraine. This is a huge political favor that Ukraine is doing to Trump, by agreeing to sign it. But right now, in the current state of this draft, yes, of course we can sign it. It's impinging on our sovereignty. It's undermining our economy. Any chance for successful restructuring, recovery, rebuilding of Ukraine after the war. And it does have a colonial spirit in it, or neo-imperialistic spirit. And unfortunately, also that's a feeling which is shared by a lot of Ukrainians, and it doesn't have anything on security guarantees, which Ukraine badly needs. And in the previous deal, actually, Ukraine insisted that there will be at least one sentence on security guarantees, but there's nothing in it right now. So I hope that our delegation will be able to go into Washington to continue, to kind of convince our American partners that changes need to be made. But we'll see whether Trump sees this as a take it or leave it deal, like no changes, you just sign it, or if you don't sign it, then we're angry with you again, and then again you're hurdle towards peace. Or maybe they will use it actually as an excuse to say, you know what, they're not working with us, we're just washing our hands away, and we cannot reach peace with both of those parties still willing to fight each other.
Well, looking at this current situation, the Trump administration soon might have its hands so full with so many different controversies that this one, the Ukraine issue, just kind of falls by the way. Now, if we look at Europe, there's been some somewhat big moves lately. I believe it was on Friday, Norway announced $7.8 billion for aid for Ukraine this year, 2025. We've seen the Czech Ammunition Coalition. They're going to be making their monthly deliveries. They've already provided 1.5 million rounds of artillery. EU defense ministers' informal summit here in Warsaw. They've garnered already half of the 2 million rounds that Ukraine has requested for this year. So you think that Europe gets it, and Europe is going to be the provider of security guarantees for Ukraine, and actually, as Ukraine goes towards the European Union, that this relationship is the one that's going to stick?
Yeah, there are two things that need to be said. On the negative side, Europe wasted a lot of time in getting its act together. For the last 3 years, while Ukraine was fighting the Russian army, Europe still was pretty much in this denialism, in this thinking about the peace dividend, which they had since the Cold War, hoping that the war will end soon, and so therefore there would be no need for some drastic, radical, principled decisions. But now they're wrong. They see that they're wrong. Not only they are dealing with Russian aggression, but also there is an unreliable American partner here. So Europe needs to get their act together. Can they do it? We have a lot of rhetorical statements But we'll see. There is still a lot of things that needs to be seen if they were done or not. That would be a litmus test. Can they produce more weapons? Right now, the West in general, but Europe in particular, is deliberately, desperately behind Russia and say North Korea, especially if you put them together in the numbers of artillery shells that they're producing. So they need to pick up on that. There are many other things. Actually, right now, Ukraine is only using something like of the weapons Ukraine uses. Only 20% that has been given by U.S. and about 25 is given by European countries. So actually, 55 is now produced in Ukraine itself.
Right.
But Europe can actually increase the share at the expense of Americans if they're not going to give any weapons. Of course, Ukraine will be left in a difficult situation with some types of weapons, like attack missiles, weapons for HIMARS, multiple launch rocket systems, and some other and Patriot missiles for the Patriot anti-aircraft missile systems. And other things. But some of those cannot be backfilled by Europe, or Europe cannot substitute quickly, at least the United States. So hence the dependence on the U.S. And of course, there is also intelligence sharing and sharing from U.S. satellites giving us imaging for continuing the war. So we do depend, but Europe can do more in terms of financial assistance. Yes, you've noted the Norway right now, but then there are other countries whose contributions are matching from what we had remaining from United States. Because by the time Trump decided to freeze temporarily the military aid to Ukraine, that was a little under $4 billion. So Norway, right there, one country in Europe, one member of so-called coalition of willing, is giving twice more. So if you add up more of those countries, and there are quite a few of them, you're actually coming up with a sizable number. So in terms of diplomatic clout, in terms of political support, in terms of financial assistance, there is a way forward. Not to mention that Europe hasn't still made a decision on the issue of using frozen Russian assets, which they might. So of course that would dramatically help them to address the financial aspect of the situation. So not actually using their national budgets, which might not be liked by public in various countries, but instead use Russian money to help Ukraine. But there is a way
Yeah,
forward. I'm not overly optimistic, but Europe has a role to play.
Well, that would be a game changer, I think, at this point. And, extraordinary times call for extraordinary measures. So let's hope everyone can step up to the plate. Volodymyr Dubovyk, the director of the Center of International Studies, thank you very much for joining me on Ukraine This Week. Appreciate the conversation, sir. And that concludes this edition of Ukraine This Week. Join us again next week from all the latest from the war in Ukraine. Thanks for watching, and see you then. Goodbye.